So, your Net Promoter Score assessment toolkit. Well, since you're watching this video, then you don't need to see the hint top right. So top right is only if you have the slides, then this is the link to watching this video as well. But before we dive in, to explain some of the perspectives that you need to really be in the driving seat of the Net Promoter Score, part of this slide deck are 4 additional sources. And the first source here in the top left is another video that I recorded where I'll explain how you can use journey mapping, surveys, but most importantly, smart statistics to really find what drives NPS. And the reason that I mention this is because later on in this video, I'll explain issues with the root cause analysis of NPS, and I will refer to that video. So I don't do things double, but you'll need that video to understand, okay, what am I saying when I mean smart statistics and the flaws that you see when you use the NPS root cause analysis. Then here on the right, this is the link to the article, the blog that Reichelt wrote for HBR, introducing the Net Promoter Score 3.0. So even Reichelt himself is feeling that there's a lot of things going wrong right now with the NPS. And he's assessing what's going wrong, but also introducing an additional metric to use, which is really interesting. It's probably too complex for many companies to measure. It's called earned growth. But the idea of also looking at the percentage of revenue coming from existing customers, I think is super valuable. And I think almost any organization can measure that, of course, if you're not a government agency. So definitely check that out. Then here on the left is an article from Forrester, Maxi. If you are looking for somebody in CX who really knows her stuff, definitely follow Maxi. And she's doing a review also of the pluses and minuses of the earned growth new ratio that Reichelt is proposing. And here on the right is a podcast that recently we took where we discussed the sense and nonsense, not only from the Net Promoter Score, but also the customer effort score. And so with these 4 sources, you have some additional information to assess, okay, what's the value or not for NPS for our own organization. Okay, let's dive in. Just a little trip down memory lane, because a lot of times what I see organizations do is that they're using NPS as, let's say, the holy metric. And what's really crucial to know is that in the beginning, when Reichelt introduces the NPS, the main goal for NPS was to measure loyalty. To really figure out, okay, what's a very simple question we can use to predict the profitability, the loyalty of a individual customer. So it was really used in the B2B setting. So it was never intended to measure more the experience and then on top of that to measure what can drive. So what are the root causes for a good experience? That's really important to keep in the back of your mind, because that is also one of the key issues right now that Reichelt is mentioning himself, why the NPS is not used in the way he intended, and also that means why NPS use is often not successful, right? Super volatile. You can't really explain why it's increasing, why it's going down. It takes maybe years or longer to actually see an effect. So just remember, the original intent of NPS was to measure profitability, right? Not in essence the experience and how you can increase the experience. So there are a few perspectives that are crucial if you want to be in the driving seat of increasing your NPS score. And I'll walk through all the 4 in the rest of the presentation. It's what's the issue with root causes, how they're being used within NPS right now, the volatility, and how can you manage that. The same with root causes. I'll also mention an example how you can improve the root cause methodology. Then how you can use direct feedback, or at least be aware of some misconceptions around direct feedback, which is often used within NPS as well, and NPS benchmarking. So first of all, the root causes. So the root cause is also at the heart of the NPS methodology nowadays, right? Not the original intent, but now it's being used. And root cause means that often when you ask the NPS question, would you recommend company X? Then either you get an open text asking why. So I can start typing, well, because, I don't know, the employee was super friendly. Or you have 2 layers of root cause that you can choose from. For example, the first list of root causes can be, for example, customer service or sales. And then depending on your choice, you get a second layer of, for example, within customer service, the employee was friendly, or I got a first time fix, I got the answer to my question. So these are the two most frequently used ways to measure the root cause, to find the root cause of NPS. So how can we enhance it? And there are several issues with both of those root cause analysis. The first one, and there you see again here that I added the link to the video explaining the drivers and how to use smart statistics. So I'll not cover the details. This is just 10 minutes, that other video, so I would definitely advise you to watch it. But one of the key issues is that we as humans are not rational beings. And when you're asking me directly, why are you giving this score? Then I'm going to rationalize my answer. So you're analyzing, even if you're analyzing 1,000 of open answers, you're analyzing my rational answers. And we've seen many times that the top X that customers say in the rational side are not the same as their latent subconscious needs. So that's a very crucial point to know, that is not helping you to create the right compass, right? You start working on those improvements, you're improving invoicing, but invoicing is not my subconscious need. Then often what I see, because I review a lot of those researches for organizations, is that the root cause that you find are super abstract. Something with invoicing, something with communication, which makes it very hard. Okay, in this specific journey, what do I need to improve to enhance communication? Or what is it within invoicing that's not going right? And so it's not helpful to really translate it to concrete improvements. And also there, when you use smart statistics within the journey that I explained in the other video, then you get much more concrete, tangible ideas for improvement. The third thing, this one, you don't know if the list of root causes is complete. When you use smart statistics, you get something that's called explained variance. That statistics, in layman's terms, is telling you whether in the eyes of the customers, you've covered all the topics that matter to them. And so if it's an open text, you have no idea whether you've used the right topics, the topics that are most impactful for customers. But also if you've predefined lists, there's a big chance that maybe there are topics that are important to customers that are not on that list. And now you have no way to verify, okay, are we anywhere near finding the drivers that matter most to our customers? So you don't know, am I really in the driving seat? And the fourth and final element is, okay, then you have a collection of number of times that people select invoicing or they select customer service. And of course, you could argue that, okay, if I don't know, 1,000 customers say it's invoicing and 500 customers say it's customer service, then invoicing has twice as much impact on NPS as customer service. But often that's not the reality. So you also don't know, if you have a list of root causes from all those open text analysis, you still don't know, okay, but what's the impact of each root cause? If you use those smart statistics, then you know, for example, hey, giving personal attention in journey X is 5 times faster to increase the NPS or satisfaction than, for example, to start improving the My account and the online environment. So it's not so much the NPS as such. There may be some challenges there, but it's mostly the root cause technique that is often having a lot of flaws, which is preventing you from having really quick improvements in NPS. Then the second thing is volatility. Almost all companies that I work with are saying, in Q1 it's, I don't know, +10, Q2 it's -20, and I have no idea how to explain it. Well, one of the key reasons behind that is because it's a calculation. So the NPS is the percentage that gives you 9 and 10 compared to the percentage giving you 0 to 6. And then you detract those from each other, which means that you're ignoring the 7 and 8s. And almost always the group giving you 7 and 8 is the largest group. So if there's only a small number of customers moving to the promoters, the 9 and 10, or the detractors, then that has a pretty significant already impact on the calculated version of the NPS. One backup plan is to have a shadow where you say, okay, I use the calculated NPS, the percentage, promoters minus detractors. And next to that, I just calculate the average NPS, like the average satisfaction. So for example, I have a 7.8 when I average NPS. That will be less volatile than let's say, the original NPS calculation. based on that way of calculating, our advice is always to say at least make sure you have 100 respondents before you draw any conclusions and start calculating an NPS. I see way too many examples where they start calculating an NPS based on 20 or 30 responses. And then the volatility goes even more nuts because it's a calculation. So also there, it's the same risk when you start, for example, in call center settings, when you start using the NPS on an individual level. Well, it's very challenging to get, I don't know, at least 30, let alone 100 respondents on an employee level. And so here you run the risk of when you start using individual NPS scores, that again, it's really not reflecting the actual experience of customers, but it's really going a little nuts. And you run the risk that employees feel, hey, I have completely no influence on NPS. You know, it's going super high one day and super low the next. So just sort of protect them from that as well. Just on a quarterly basis, make the average of teams, for example, but be very careful with using individual NPS scores. And what we also saw, I'm not sure if you know the difference, you have something called brand NPS. That's would you recommend to the organization. And more companies are using something that's called the transactional NPS. Would you recommend company X based on this phone call, based on the visit of the account manager? So based on a transaction. Again, remember the origin of NPS had nothing to do with this transactional side, right? So it's becoming more and more, let's say, detailed how the NPS is being used, much more also aligned with satisfaction. And there you see that the transactional NPS is also much more volatile. What we saw, if you just measure once a year the brand NPS and you measure it for several years while you are working to enhance experience, you then see a pretty stable increase in both the Net Promoter Score as well as satisfaction. So brand NPS, fine. Check it once a year to see if you are moving in the right direction. I've already mentioned satisfaction, right, versus Net Promoter Score. And across several organizations, we've compared both. So we've measured both satisfaction and NPS. And I think one of the first things that I think that you need to understand is that a lot of people, mostly proponents of NPS, are saying sentences like, merely being satisfied is no longer enough. And while that's absolutely true, that doesn't mean that high score on satisfaction is not a good indicator of loyalty. And so what we've seen a lot of signs is from an 8 or more, so 8, 9, or 10, in satisfaction, that's where you get an exponential increase of loyalty, doing more business with you, doing longer business. So indeed, merely being satisfied is no longer enough, but you can also measure not merely being satisfied with satisfaction. So if you make sure that you are working towards an 8+ in satisfaction, then you're still seeing the, let's see, the extremely positive impact of experience, right? 8, 9, or 10 score. When we compared the brand NPS with the general satisfaction of an organization, we also saw that just seeing how much of the NPS scores are, let's say, influenced by satisfaction, that it's 80%. And the impact of satisfaction on NPS is also 89. Which means that there's not a big difference between satisfaction and the NPS metric. And then again, if you see in the last few years how NPS has become, let's say, much more used in a transactional sense, and so much more as it were a satisfaction metric, it makes sense that it becomes more and more as a normal for respondents to fill out as if it were satisfaction. We also saw that the drivers of satisfaction and the drivers of NPS were comparable. And so also there's not a huge differentiation between satisfaction and NPS. Again, as long as you're steering towards 8+ in satisfaction. And what we also saw, we had an article, there was an article a few years ago in the Harvard Business Review where they introduced the customer effort score. And the customer effort score is how easy is it for you to do something. For example, how easy is it to fill out this form on the website? So all about ease of doing things. And what they saw in their study is that the customer effort score was a way better predictor of loyalty, defined as repeat purchases, then NPS is satisfaction. Well, stubborn as we were back then in the organization I worked for, we said, okay, let's see if we can reproduce these results. So we reproduced it, and then we saw the complete opposite. So what we saw is that the customer effort score was the least predictive, but again, that NPS and satisfaction were almost having the same impact on loyalty. So think looking back when the NPS was introduced 20 years ago with the original goal, meaning profitability, predicting loyalty, compared to right now that it's being used in each measurement, in each transaction. So let's say the original differentiating value of Net Promoter Score has been diminishing because of how it's being used. So that also makes sense why satisfaction and NPS are no longer super differentiating. Then another element. So a lot of organizations also talk about something called like a direct feedback loop or a closed feedback loop. Meaning we send out a survey, people fill in the survey, and if there, for example, is a score of 6 or lower, we reach out and we contact those customers to see how we can increase the Net Promoter Score. Direct feedback. And what happens is that a lot of organizations completely overestimate the impact of doing direct feedback loop. And what I always do is I then share this calculation with them to understand, okay, but what actually is the impact of direct feedback? So let's walk you through the calculation. Let's assume that 100% of your customers are receiving a survey after doing something with you, which of course is never the case, right? So all these percentages are max. They will be much lower in reality. But for the calculation, 100% receives a survey. Let's assume 20% response, which is a fair, pretty high percentage. Let's assume that a quarter of those customers is a detractor, giving you a score between 0 and 6. And assuming that you will reach out to those customers, that means you're only reaching out to 5% of your customers. And remember, in reality, it may be just 1 or 2%, right? Because the percentages will be way lower. So if you're investing a lot of time in creating a direct feedback loop, just realize that you're only impacting, let's say, 2 to 5% of your customers. 95, you will not call them because they don't fit the criteria. Of course, for that individual customer that you're going to call, you can make a huge impact, right? So I'm not disqualifying the idea. I'm just helping you to assess the impact. Then some companies say, okay, I understand this is helpful, but I can impact 100% by learning from the feedback of the customers that we're calling that are not happy. And there the risk is, again, as I mentioned, the root causes. When you start analyzing their feedback, you get a lot of rational reasons why they were not happy, and you start tweaking the wrong drivers. So just be aware, if you're using direct feedback loop, it tends to be more applicable in a really, let's say, high trust B2B context. But when you have thousands and thousands of B2C customers, this is completely infeasible to achieve. Then I think one of the final topics, benchmarking. Well, I created a separate podcast to benchmark or not to benchmark. So let me not repeat the whole podcast. But I see a lot of companies wanting to benchmark their NPS. Just be very, very careful, because I've seen a lot of NPS research, and even the creativity of the scales being used. I seriously have seen NPS scales of scale of 1 to 5, scale of 1 to 7. And they are all being reported as NPS. Or, for example, you have no idea if a company is using the NPS, let's say, directly after I call the customer service. So directly after a touch point, the scores are always also super high, versus maybe you are measuring the NPS completely at the end of a journey, which might mean a lower NPS, or you're measuring your brand NPS. So when you're benchmarking with other organizations, if you want to benchmark, but then listen to the podcast to see whether you even should benchmark. But if you're benchmarking, make sure that you really ask, okay, but when are you measuring this NPS? How are you measuring this NPS? To really understand, is this a fair benchmark for us or not? Okay, despite the whole debate of which metric, I mean, in the end, the key is if you measure something, you analyze how to improve it, you start improving, and you see the thing, whatever the metric is, go up, check in the box, keep doing what you're doing, right? That's the basic of everything. Whether it's satisfaction or NPS, again, where there's no debate is that the key to be successful, to financialize customer experience, is to really make sure that you create a score of 8 or more. And the same for NPS, 30 or 70 plus is comparable to an 8 plus or a 9 plus in satisfaction. So you have to be pretty exceptional to really see the financial effect of customer experience. To conclude, 2 scenarios. If you're bored, if your organization is really pushing for NPS, well, now you have the tools to make sure that you really are in the driving seat of NPS to see what's the fastest way to enhance it and maybe add additional metrics like the earned growth ratio of Reichgeld, or maybe also satisfaction, the customer effort score. If your organization is not pushing on NPS, then take the time to really assess, is NPS the best metric for us? If yes, then make sure you figure out, okay, but what's the best way to use the surveys to find a driver so you really are in the optimal position to actually increase NPS within just a few months. All right, just to repeat, as I started again, there are some additional sources here. So I think this one is the main video if you're interested in understanding how can I really find what drives NPS, to have the fastest way to increase the NPS, so to replace the existing root cause analysis. And what's the role of journey mapping connected to finding those drivers. The original article from Reichgeld, where he introduces the issues with the current way of measuring NPS. For example, that he feels it's way too much used as a target, where the target becomes important instead of, hey, I think we all should treat customers very well. And he introduces the new metric, NPS 3.0, which is called earned growth, where you're also looking at what's the percentage of revenue growth from existing customers. The review of Forrester on the introduction of earned growth of Reichgeld, and the podcast on the customer effort score and the net promoter score. And just remember, if you like the podcast, then you also find, if you click on the link to the customer effort score and NPS, in that list of episodes, you'll also find an episode of To Benchmark or Not to Benchmark, where I explain that in a little more detail. All right, that's it. I hope it was helpful to really feel more secure in assessing when is NPS useful and when it's not, so you can add more value to your organization and actually enhance experience with measurable results. In that case, I can only say, let's keep on changing the world.